Hello, and welcome back to the 6.5 Summit. I'm Shelley Kramer, one of the founding partners at Futurum Research, and my team and I at Futurum and the team at More Insights and Strategy are really glad that you're here. In this Fireside Chat discussion today, Futurum's Daniel Newman sits down with Otho Lyon from Cloudera, and they're going to talk about customer experience as a service in the public sector and what that means for digital transformation across industries as a whole. Founded in 2008, headquartered in Silicon Valley, Cloudera is comprised of some of the brightest minds in technology, and they're passionate about open source, open standards, and open markets. The company's commitment is to empowering people to transform complex data into clear and actionable insights, making infinite things possible. I don't know about you, but that's what I'm looking for, making infinite things possible. So without further ado, let's pop over and listen to this conversation and see what we can learn.
Otho Lyon, welcome to the 6.5 Summit. How are you doing today?
I'm doing well, Dan. Thank you for having me. Absolutely.
You know, I gotta say, I love the shirt. You look great.
Great minds think alike, right?
Yeah, I feel like we had to coordinate this. Someone must have told you that blue is a great color for camera.
I had someone kind of guide me on that. Yeah, absolutely.
That's good. I have people guide me. I've been doing this for years, and I still have people that tell me where to sit, how to sit, where to face, what to say. It's all good stuff. It makes us all better every single day.
Absolutely.
Well, I'm super excited to have you on the 6.5 Summit with us. You know, it's a great session ahead. Public sector is a topic that doesn't always get the front and center attention in a lot of these tech events, but boy, is the public sector a big client when it comes to technology. So I'm really excited to dig into that with you. But you know, I would love to have you just take a minute, Otho, and just do a quick introduction of yourself and even more, a quick introduction of Cloudera for anyone out there that's not familiar, because while I track it closely and I've had a lot to say about it, not necessarily a household name yet. So how about that quick intro, and then we'll dive into the topic at hand.
Hey, yeah, thanks, Dan. You know, Otho Lyon, I'm Director of Public Sector and Global Programs for Cloudera. And if you don't know Cloudera is an edged AI big data analytics company. You know, I've been at Cloudera for about 4 years, but we provide, you know, the solutions for big data and companies that absolutely have a lot of data out there. And the federal government is one of those agencies and governments that have a lot of data. They really do.
Yeah, that's great. And it's not only is it a really large player, it's actually now the product of two of the largest players in the open source big data space. When you guys came together with Hortonworks, and that's not an old story.
Right.
And actually, you've had the CEOs come back, Robert Bearden.
Yep.
The company's doing a lot of things, and there's been a lot of excitement around the company over the last few months. I've been tracking that really closely. You know, I'm excited to talk about sort of what's going on in the public sector, the federal government, and just this whole public sector space. It's gotten a lot of attention over the past several months. We've had some very interesting things going on around the country here, around the world, but certainly here in the U.S. And government, it's a 24-hour news cycle, and it certainly keeps everybody's attention. But data, you know, we've got a pandemic, we've got you know, a ongoing conversation about driving equality. These are things that the government is trying to do, and data is going to be really at the root of it in terms of making decisions. And you're working on that. And in fact, Cloudera has really been instrumental working with a number of agencies, federally, locally. You know, talk a little bit about how Cloudera was able to establish itself. How have you guys been able to become so influential and important to the public sector and what they're doing?
Sure, Dan. Let's first talk about, you know, the U.S. federal government, right, and the government's data strategy. You know, back in June 2019, President Trump established, you know, that federal data strategy, and you know, the vision is to, you know, help deliver, you know, data in the 21st century. And you know, the government's mission is fully leverage all that federal data that, you know, to its missions, to the services, you know, in an ethical and a conscientious design and in a learning culture, right? And so, you know, a couple of the mandates that President Trump has put out there is IT modernization, data accountability, and people, the future workforce. So, we are talking about how much data that's out there. I was looking, and there's numbers out there, but the one that stuck out to me was there's 2.5 quintillion bytes of data. It happens per day, and the government is considerably one of the largest generators of all that data. So, one of the things I've seen is, Cloudera has been able to help government agencies. The thing I see a lot of people talk about cloud, right? And when they think cloud, they lump it all together. But I think agencies need to start looking at having a cloud strategy. They also need to look at having a data strategy. And it's something that a lot of agencies really don't get into. So Cloudera has been able to help agencies think about their data. What is, the one thing I think about data is, what is the story telling you? When people, put data together and say, hey, well, here's your data, but what is the data telling you? What is the story behind that data? So, it's very interesting because, we kind of fall into, some of those lanes when it comes to, helping the government really figure out the strategy here, whether it's security, whether it's privacy, whether it's confidentiality. We have all those tools. SDX is one of our tools that we use that plays into that, right? And so, helping the government to really understand how to manage this data, because we did a survey back in May, and 94% of federal IT managers, say they are focused on data, and it's significant. And they're going to focus even more. But then 90% believe that data should be robust across all data sets. But here's the challenge is only 51% of them have any governance policy. So now you still have data that's siloed, right? And that's the challenge. Governments having data that's siloed. That you can't use it. If agencies can't share data, we've had this conversation before, right? So now we're at Cloudera, we're able to help them with that, and some of that is I mentioned before is our XDX, to get them out of these silos and help them try to share data across platforms, and obviously when you start doing that, governments get real concerned about security. They get real concerned about confidentiality and those things, but Cloudera is positioning itself to be able to do that. So,
yeah, you covered a lot of ground there, but a lot of interesting things. I mean, the data initiative at the federal level is significant and it's material. The fact of the matter is that we need systems that help us get more accuracy. Mm-hmm. Again, I mentioned the pandemic, but that's just one example. But the reason I bring that up is so much of the reason that we are struggling to come up with a federal policy, I think, has to do with data that needs to continue to be enriched and provide more clarity and provide answers with less scrutiny and less manipulation. And that's where things like ML and AI come into play. That's where having real-time, data at the edge, being able to be added in real time to be processed, having neural networks and frameworks and deep learning that can continue to enrich the algorithms to make sure it gets narrower and narrower. And we're still working towards it. And I would generally say, to your credit and to the technology industry, it's usually not the industry that's slow. Usually it's the industry trying to meet the customer where it is. And in many cases with public sector, it still lags a little bit behind what the technology is able to support. Let's bounce into the next topic, though. I mentioned Cloudera. Obviously, there's a lot of companies in data, but open source has been really hot. You mentioned about cloud strategies and data strategies. Well, in cloud, everybody sort of is starting to see open source and application development. But when it comes to data, there's a big story behind being open source as well. And that's really where Cloudera has put a lot of its muscle. Why has open source been a vehicle to be more valuable to public sector than a lot of other maybe closed loop, closed architecture, and other data platforms that are good but aren't open source?
Right. Well, open source enables that rapid activation of new technology, right? The government. You stated before, it's kind of one of those things where the private sector is kind of moving a little bit ahead of the government when it comes to a lot of this data, the analytics and, technology and things of that nature. And so, open source within the government, I think the government needs to recognize that it needs to be agnostic, right? Especially when it comes to cloud and compute and storage. You want those environments that are open storage and open compute, because it creates a non or it creates a vendor lock-in, right, if you don't do it, right? And one thing I've known about the government, the government wants this interoperability, and, in order to do that, environment, and if you want to optimize your environments, from whether it's hybrid or multi-cloud, or if you want to have, the multiple analytical functions, you need to be able to have that open environment, right? And that's where, you're seeing, if you notice, you're seeing open source start to, it is a buzzword. It's starting to rise up even in, you're talking about smart cities, right? Or municipalities that are using, open source, to gain intelligence. And because right now you have all this IoT data, right? And this IoT data is powerful, but unless you're able to be agile and make those adjustments and drive those intelligent conversations or decisions, it's going to be difficult. Think about a city now. You got cities now that, are monitoring real-time traffic and, high parking volumes. And even if you look at, utilities and things of that nature, power and water, that's a lot of data that's coming in there. And then security, cameras, you can't go anywhere where there's not a camera. So, you look at it, these types of things are powered by open source, and they're very agile. But one other thing that a lot of people don't even think about is, these smart bases, right? I think about, Fort Bragg and some of these other bases where, you have, soldiers, and you have, the health of those soldiers, and you have cooling systems, you have fleet management, so all this IoT data, it's so massive, but you need to be agile to be able to make decisions with this data. And I think open source is what's driving this. And so, yes, Cloudera absolutely, provides that framework, in my opinion. And, so we have, there and again, I'll go back, there's a lot of products that we have, but there's that XDX that really helps agencies to be able to provide that level of where you collect the data, you enrich the data, you report that data, you serve that data, and then you can use that predictive analysis to figure out what you want to do with that data, and it drives you to decisions.
Yeah, you had a lot to unpack there, but one thing that you did say, you talked about cameras everywhere, and it immediately made me think about another challenge the public sector is dealing with, and that's privacy.
Yeah.
Throughout this recent, pandemic and the global discussion around equality, we've seen how data, AI, ML still has some issues. It still can be somewhat inaccurate with certain computer vision, for one. You've seen a number of big tech companies sort of say, we're not going to, at this point in time, support facial recognition when it's being used for certain surveillance type activities. And that really comes down to, we've got this real battle between the fact that we as a society basically disclose all of our data willingly, voluntarily, for consumption by public sector, by corporations and everyone else. But concurrently, just because we decide to disclose it doesn't mean that we've completely waived our rights to some level of privacy.
That's
and
correct.
So you're really walking a balance, because your technology is really an enabler. You're the enabler of decoupling all this information, of giving public sector agencies, security agencies, insights and information at a very granular level. You're also the type of technology that can take big swaths of data, anonymize it, depersonalize it in some capacities to make it useful for local and government agencies to provide experiences to customers, constituents, whatever. I think of myself as a customer, although the service isn't always great. So there's a lot to go. So that was a really long way of kind of arriving at the fact that in public sector, you guys have this balance you have to play around privacy. How are you achieving that?
So, obviously, with the privacy conversation, we have to, you're right, we have to absolutely walk a thin line there. We're being conscientious about what, we invest in and what we will be a part of and what we won't be a part of. And with our leaders, we kind of take a look at, things that when they come in, does this, play into our core values, right? And so, and that's one of the things, with this new, even with the racial, Black Lives Matters and things of that nature, it's changed the whole dynamic of how corporations look at, what they do and what they participate in, what they won't participate in. And we have a good balance with, our leaders within sales and our CEO, Rob Bearden, to talk about these things to determine whether or not this is something that we want to forge ahead and do or we don't want to do.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's a really big question all companies are asking right now about the technology, what this technology enables, because again, there's a lot of ways these technologies can be applied for good, for safety, for security, for health, for just enrichment in communities, both on a local and on a federal level. So we don't want to see that get, basically data is going to help us decide what data to use, but we need to make sure that we keep progressing with that. Since you brought it up, the public sector, you've been advising this for a number of years. You mentioned not just here at Cloudera, but when we talked offline, you mentioned you did it for a longer period of time for NetApp and for other organizations. You've been around it. Diversity has gotten a big spotlight on it, and it's been due time. It's a good thing. Yourself as someone of diversity in the workforce yourselves, you're seeing it from both sides as it personally affecting you as well as you're helping these agencies and your work. What are sort of your views? What are you seeing? How is it changing, within the public sector in particular right now, Otho?
What's interesting is, and it's a good question. When we were out in the field and able to visit agencies and things of that nature, what's amazing is public sector, especially a lot of the government agencies, they've kind of figured out, okay, we need to make sure that we have a diverse workforce, right? And so when you walk into the agencies, you'd be surprised how well there's a blended field of individuals working in different agencies. Not all, but for the most part, the ones that I've seen. I think where the challenge is even trying to translate that to private sector, right? Public sector tries to adhere to, what the population says. If it's 13% here or 20%, whatever the numbers are, they try to adhere to that. And they've done, in my opinion, a really good job at doing that. It's the private sector where we've had the challenges, right? And so, in my 15 years of being in public sector, supporting public sector, it has been challenging because, the diversity in private sector has not necessarily been, where I would have hoped it would have been by now. But, you're right. Now's the time for us to try to make a change here. Cloudera is actually doing a couple of initiatives. I actually work on what we call the Equality Committee within Cloudera, and I report directly to Rob Bearden. And we're working on some initiatives that are internal as well as external. And I'm excited about that because I think, now it's an opportunity for us to really, change the pendulum and really make a long-lasting legacy for the next generation, because that's the thing now. We're fighting for the next generation.
Yeah, I'm really glad that we had a chance to kind of touch on that. I think it's really timely right now. I think sometimes in tech, the industry as a whole can sort of breeze by on some of the more difficult topics because we're so busy doing all the cool stuff. Right. We're the ones enabling all these video meetings, and we're the ones enabling, all the gaming, all the Netflix binge watching, all the things that we did to stay distracted amongst the pandemic, even all the watching that we did about what was going on with the equality conversations. Right. But at the same time, we really are responsible to be the leaders in these discussions, to, these companies, yours, many of that are participating here in this summit are some of the companies that are the loudest voices, making some of the biggest commitments and impacts, both to our health and to our equality. So I'm glad, you were able to share some thoughts. I'm glad to hear that Cloudera is specifically doing some things. Otho Lyon, I just want to say thank you so much for joining me here at the 6.5 Summit. It's great to hear all the things that you're doing and about what's going on with big data in the public sector.
It's my pleasure. Thank you so much.
And thanks everybody for tuning into this session, and we hope to see you in the next session real soon. Appreciate it. For now, we're saying goodbye to this